Picture a scorching July day at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, crowds buzzing, when two white cops, Travis Holt and Kyle Dunn, slam Dr. Lena Brooks, a black woman in a crisp navy blazer, against a wall. Handcuffs snap tight. Their slurs echo. "You think you're untouchable, huh?" Holt growls. Travelers stare, stunned. Lena, unshaken, whispers, "You'll regret this." Her voice a blade of ice. The cops scoff, blind to the storm brewing. This clash will torch their lives, but how? Hey, where are you watching from? If you stand for justice, hit like, subscribe, and join us for more epic battles against the odds. The air at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport hung thick with summer heat, a sticky 92 degrees Fahrenheit pressing down on the sprawling terminal. Dr. Lena Brooks stepped off her flight from Seattle, her navy blazer still sharp despite the 12-hour journey, her dark eyes scanning the chaos of travelers with a quiet intensity. At 42, she carried herself like a woman who'd fought for every inch of her success. A cybersecurity expert who'd just keynoted a tech conference, her mind still buzzing with algorithms and threats. Her polished leather boots clicked against the tile as she moved toward baggage claim, weaving through a sea of rolling suitcases and harried voices, her focus locked on grabbing her gear and getting home to Midtown. She'd earned a glass of wine after dismantling a room full of skeptics who'd smirked at her credentials until she'd run circles around their questions. But the universe had other plans. Two figures loomed ahead, their shadows cutting through, the crowd like vultures circling prey. Officer Travis Holt, a lanky 6'3" slab of arrogance with a buzzed blonde head, leaned against a pillar near the escalators, his arms folded tight across his chest. Beside him stood Officer Kyle Dunn, shorter but broad, his meaty hands flexing as if itching for a fight, his lips curled into a permanent sneer. Both wore the crisp blue of airport police, badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. But their eyes held something darker, a glint of malice that zeroed in on Lena the moment she came into view. She didn't notice them at first. Her thoughts, still on the conference, on the standing ovation she'd left behind. But their stares burned into her like a spotlight she couldn't shake. Holt nudged Dunn, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the terminal's hum. "Check her out. Too fancy for her kind." Dunn chuckled, a guttural sound that made a nearby toddler flinch, his gaze raking over Lena's tailored suit. The sleek silver watch on her wrist, the confident tilt of her chin. "Yeah, strutting like she owns the place. Bet she's hiding something." Their words weren't loud, but they carried, a deliberate taunt meant to prick at her edges, to see if she'd bite. Lena's stride didn't falter, but her ears caught. The jab, her jaw tightening as she kept moving, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a glance. She'd heard worse, dealt with bigger bigots, but today she just wanted her bag and her couch, not a showdown. Too bad Holt and Dunn had other ideas. They peeled off the pillar in unison, their boots thudding against the floor as they closed the gap, cutting through the crowd with the swagger of men who knew no one would stop them. Travelers parted like water, some casting nervous looks. Others, pretending not to see, the unspoken rule of airports kicking in. Don't get involved. Lena reached the baggage claim, her hand brushing the strap of her carry-on, when Holt's voice boomed behind her, deep and laced with venom. "Hey you, stop right there." She froze, her fingers curling into a fist, then turned slowly, her expression a mask of steel as she faced them. Holt towered over her, his pale blue eyes narrowing as he sized her up, while Dunn flanked her left, his bulk blocking her path to the exit. Up close, she could smell the stale coffee on Holt's breath, see the faint scar snaking across Dunn's knuckles, and feel the weight of their contempt pressing down like a physical force. "What's the problem, officers?" she asked, her voice steady, each syllable clipped with precision, betraying none of the fire simmering beneath. Holt smirked, crossing his arms so his badge caught the light, a silent flex of power. "We need to see some ID. You look like you might be carrying more than just luggage." Dunn jumped in, his tone mocking, his lips twisting as he spoke. "Yeah, dressed like that, you're probably a mule or something. Too good to be true, right?" The accusation landed like a slap, raw and unfiltered, the kind of casual racism Lena had navigated since she was old enough to notice the stares. A black woman in a suit walking with purpose was a threat in their eyes, a puzzle that didn't fit their warped little world. She took a slow breath, her mind racing through her options, knowing this wasn't about suspicion. It was about control. "I've cleared security, passed every check, there's no reason for this," she said, her gaze flicking between them, daring them to justify it. Holt's smirk widened, his head tilting as if she'd just proved his point. "Oh, we've got plenty of reason. You look shifty, too polished. What's a girl like you doing with all that attitude?" Dunn laughed, stepping closer, his shadow swallowing the space between them. "Hand it over, or we'll make this harder than it needs to be." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a few passengers pausing to watch, phones slipping out of pockets, lenses glinting as they started to record. Lena felt the eyes on her, the weight of a dozen silent judgments, but she kept her focus on the cops, her pulse steady even as her blood boiled. She reached into her blazer, pulling out her wallet with deliberate calm, her fingers brushing the embossed leather before sliding her driver's license free. "Here," she said, holding it out to Holt, her voice flat, but her eyes burning with defiance. He didn't take it. Instead, he let it hang there for a beat, then flicked his wrist, sending it tumbling to the grimy floor with a soft thud. "Oops," he said, his grin splitting wide as Dunn barked a laugh, the sound harsh and grating. "Guess you'll need to pick that up, sweetheart." The crowd shifted, a woman gasping, a man muttering under his breath, but no one stepped forward. Lena's chest tightened, her nails digging into her palms. But she didn't bend, didn't break. She locked eyes with Holt, her stare a silent promise, then crouched slowly, retrieving the license with a grace that made his mockery look cheap. She stood, holding it out again, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Check it, now." Holt snatched it this time, glancing at it with a scoff, passing it to Dunn, who squinted at the photo like it was a forgery. "Lena Brooks, huh? Fancy name for a fancy lady. Doesn't mean squat to me." He tossed it back, the card skittering across the floor again, and before she could react, Dunn lunged, grabbing her arm and twisting it hard behind her back. Pain shot through her shoulder, a white-hot jolt, but she bit down on a gasp, refusing to give them the sound they craved. "You're resisting," Dunn growled, his grip tightening as he yanked her other wrist, the cold steel of handcuffs snapping shut with a click that echoed in her ears. Holt stepped in front, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and sour. "Should've cooperated, princess. Now you're coming with us." The cuffs bit into her skin, the metal unyielding, but Lena didn't flinch, didn't scream. She straightened as best she could, her voice low and lethal despite the strain. "Badge numbers. I've got them. You're done." Holt laughed, a sharp, ugly sound, clapping Dunn on the shoulder as they shoved her forward, her boots scuffing the tile. "Big talk for a nobody," he said. But there was a flicker in his eyes, a crack in his bravado he didn't even know was there. The crowd grew, phones multiplying, red dots blinking as they captured every second, a digital net closing around the cops they couldn't see. Lena's mind raced, cataloging their faces, their words, their every move, her memory a steel trap locking it all in. She'd been here before, not in cuffs, but in the crosshairs of men like them, men who thought power came from a badge and a sneer. They thought they'd won this round, thought they'd humbled her, but they'd just lit a fuse they couldn't snuff out. As they dragged her toward a security office, the terminal buzzing with whispers and outrage, Lena's lips twitched, the ghost of a smile forming. They'd started a war they couldn't finish, and she was already 3 steps ahead. The security office door clanged shut behind Lena Brooks, the sound a dull thud against the buzzing chaos of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Her wrists ached where the cuffs had bitten into her skin, the red marks still fresh. As Officer Travis Holt and Officer Kyle Dunn shoved her into a chipped metal chair, the room stank of stale sweat and burnt coffee, a flickering bulb overhead casting jagged shadows across their smug faces. Holt leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his blonde buzz cut glinting like a warning sign, while Dunn paced, his thick frame radiating menace. "Gonna be a long day for you, princess," Holt said, his voice dripping with venom, his pale eyes locked on her like she was a trophy he'd bagged. Lena sat still, her navy blazer creased but her spine straight, her dark gaze cutting through them with the precision of a laser. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just let the silence stretch, her mind already turning, plotting, waiting for the crack she knew would come. Outside, the terminal hummed with life, travelers oblivious to the storm brewing in this cramped box. But the air inside crackled with tension, a standoff poised to snap. How long could they hold her here, she wondered, before someone noticed? What kind of game were they playing, thinking they'd break her? The answer came faster than she expected. The door swung open, hinges squealing, and in strode Marla Evans, a TSA supervisor with 20 years on the job, her dark skin glistening under the harsh light, her uniform crisp despite the July heat. Her eyes widened as they landed on Lena, then narrowed as she clocked the cuffs dangling from the chair, the smirk on Holt's face, the way Dunn's hand hovered near his baton. "What in the hell is going on here?" she barked, her voice a whip crack that made Dunn freeze mid-step. Holt straightened, his smirk faltering, but he recovered fast, jutting his chin out like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "Just a routine stop, ma'am." She was acting suspicious, resisting. Marla's gaze flicked to Lena, catching the conference badge clipped to her blazer, the bold print screaming, "Cyber Security Summit, Seattle." Recognition flashed across her face, a spark of something Holt and Dunn couldn't see. "Suspicious, huh? That why you've got her cuffed like some street thug?" She stepped closer, peering at the badge, then back at Lena, her brow lifting. "Dr. Lena Brooks, the keynote speaker? I saw your talk stream last night. You're legit. Let her go, now." The room tilted, a seismic shift neither cop had braced for. Holt's jaw tightened, his fingers flexing, but Marla's authority wasn't up for debate, her stance a wall they couldn't climb. Dunn muttered something under his breath, a slur swallowed by the hum of the AC, but Holt shot him a look, silencing him. "Fine," Holt growled, stomping over to Lena, his boots thudding like a tantrum. He yanked the key from his belt, fumbling as he unlocked the cuffs, the metal clattering to the floor with a hollow ring. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, the words forced, bitter, his eyes promising payback as he stepped back. Lena rubbed her wrists, the sting fading, but the fire in her chest roaring hotter. She stood, smoothing her blazer, her voice calm, but edged with steel. "You'll hear from me." Dunn snorted, turning away, but Holt's glare followed her out, a silent vow hanging in the air. Marla escorted her back to the terminal, the crowd parting as whispers spread, phones still rolling, capturing the aftermath. "You okay?" Marla asked, her tone softening, but Lena just nodded, her mind already on the next move. She dodged this bullet, outsmarted their little power trip, and as she reached baggage claim, her shoulders relaxed, a rare breath of relief slipping free. The wind felt good, fleeting but sweet, a taste of justice she could savor. She scanned the conveyor belt, spotting her sleek black roller bag, its tag fluttering as it rounded the bend. She grabbed it, hefting it with a grunt, ready to head home and leave this mess behind. But then her fingers brushed something jagged, a tear in the fabric she hadn't noticed before. She froze, heart lurching, and pulled the bag closer, inspecting the gash. The zipper hung open, threads frayed, and inside her conference notes, her laptop, her backup drive, all gone. Her stomach dropped, a cold sweat prickling her spine. This wasn't an accident. She glanced around, the terminal's bustle blurring into a haze, and caught a glimpse of Holt and Dunn across the hall, leaning against a kiosk, their heads bent together, smirking like wolves who'd just marked their prey. Holt's hand dipped into his pocket, pulling out a small black device, a tracker, spinning it between his fingers before tucking it away. Dunn chuckled, clapping him on the back, their eyes locking on her for a split second before they turned and vanished into the crowd. Lena's breath hitched, her victory souring into something darker, a realization sinking in like a stone. They'd let her go, sure, but they weren't done. This was round one, and they'd already rigged the board for round two. Her hands tightened on the bag, her mind racing, piecing it together. They'd slashed her stuff, planted something, and now they were watching, waiting. She'd thought she'd won, thought Marla's intervention had shut it down, but they'd turned her moment of triumph into a trap she couldn't see coming. What kind of men held a grudge this deep? How far would they go to bury her? She straightened, forcing her pulse to steady, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the exits. She'd survived their first swing, but the game had just begun, and she'd be damned if she let them catch her off guard again. Hey, what do you think about Lena's fight so far? Comment number 1 if you're rooting for her to take these cops down hard, or number 2 if you think they've got more tricks up their sleeves. If you're fired up about her standing tall against this injustice, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and stick with us to see how she flips the script. Could you outsmart a setup like that? Or would you be scrambling? Now here's the big question. What's Holt planning with that tracker? And how's Lena gonna dodge the next blow? Lena Brooks gripped the steering wheel of her silver sedan, the Atlanta skyline blurring past as she wove through the late afternoon traffic, the heat still clinging to the asphalt at a brutal 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Her slashed roller bag sat in the passenger seat, a jagged reminder of Holt and Dunn's parting shot, the missing notes and laptop a wound she couldn't ignore. Her wrist still throbbed from the cuffs, faint bruises blooming beneath her dark skin. But her mind was sharp, replaying the airport clash, the tracker in Holt's hand, the smirk that promised more. She'd left Hartsfield-Jackson thinking she'd won. Marla's intervention a shield against their venom, but the gash in her bag told a different story. They weren't done, not by a long shot, and the weight of that truth pressed down like a storm cloud she couldn't outrun. She needed gas, a quick stop before home, so she pulled into a Shell station off Peachtree Road, the lot quiet except for a pickup idling near the pumps. She stepped out, the humid air sticking to her navy blazer, and swiped her card, the nozzle clicking as fuel gurgled into the tank. Her eyes scanned the lot, habit from years of cybersecurity work, always watching for threats in the code or the shadows. She didn't see the unmarked cruiser slip in behind her, its engine a low growl masked by the hum of the city. Travis Holt slid out, his blonde buzz cut catching the fading sun, his uniform swapped for a plain black tee and jeans, but the arrogance still clung to him like a second skin. Kyle Dunn followed, his bulk squeezed into a gray hoodie, his scarred knuckles flexing as he cracked them one by one. They'd tracked her from the airport, the little black device Holt had flashed, now pinging her every move, a digital leash she hadn't spotted yet. Holt nodded to Dunn, a silent signal, and they split, moving with the casual menace of hunters who knew their prey was cornered. Lena finished pumping, capping the tank, when Dunn's voice cut through the stillness, loud and deliberate. "Ma'am, we need a word." She turned, her pulse spiking as she clocked him lumbering toward her, his hands in his pockets, his grin a twisted thing that didn't reach his eyes. "Routine check," he said, stepping close, too close, his shadow swallowing the space between them. "Pop the trunk." Her gut twisted, but she kept her face blank, her voice steady despite the alarm bells screaming in her head. "I've done nothing wrong. You've got no cause." Dunn chuckled, a low rumble, leaning in until she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "We say you do. Open it, or I'll do it for you." Across the lot, Holt lingered near the pumps, his back to them, pretending to fiddle with his phone. But his fingers dipped into a plastic bag, pulling out a brick of white powder wrapped tight in cellophane. He crouched, quick and smooth, sliding it into her trunk through a gap she'd never notice, the tracker's signal masking his move. Lena's eyes flicked to the station's security camera, a rusty dome above the cashier's window, and she squared her shoulders, refusing to budge. "Show me a warrant or step off." Dunn's grin faded, his hand shooting out to grab her arm, twisting it just enough to make her wince, a replay of the airport but rougher, meaner. "You don't call the shots, lady," he snarled, shoving her toward the car door, his bulk pinning her as he played the distraction. Holt finished, dusting his hands, and sauntered back, his voice cutting in with mock concern. "Everything okay here?" Dunn released her, stepping back with a shrug, his eyes glinting with triumph. "Just a chat. She's good to go." Lena rubbed, her arm, her skin hot where he'd gripped her, suspicion clawing at her chest. But the trunk was closed, the gas station quiet again, and they were already walking away, Holt tossing a lazy wave over his shoulder. She slid back into the driver's seat, her breath shallow, her mind racing. Something was off, but she couldn't pin it. Not yet. She pulled out, merging into traffic, the sedan humming as she aimed for home. The midtown condo, a sanctuary she craved after this hellish day. She didn't see the cruiser peel off behind her, didn't hear the radio crackle as Holt muttered, "Give it 5." 4 miles later, as she crossed a bridge over the Chattahoochee River, blue lights erupted in her rear view, a symphony of sirens splitting the air. She glanced back, her heart slamming against her ribs, and saw not 1, not 2, but 6 squad. Cars boxing her in, tires screeching as they forced her to the shoulder. Doors flew open, guns drawn, barrels glinting in the dusk, a dozen voices shouting over each other. "Step out, dealer. Hands where we can see them." Lena froze, her hands trembling on the wheel, then raised them slow, deliberate, her mind scrambling. To catch up, dealer, what the hell were they talking about? She pushed the door open, stepping onto the gravel, the air thick with exhaust and menace, her blazer flapping in the wind as a burly cop she didn't recognize stormed forward, his face red, his Glock steady. "On the ground now," he bellowed, spit flying, while others fanned out, circling her like sharks. She complied, knees hitting the dirt, her eyes darting to the crowd forming on the bridge, phones out, filming the chaos. Holt and Dunn hung back, blending with the uniforms, their smirks hidden but their fingerprints all over this. The burly cop yanked her trunk open, a triumphant grunt escaping as he held up the brick of powder, waving it like a flag. "Gotcha," he said, turning to the others, his voice loud for the cameras. "Cocaine right here. She's done." Lena's blood ran cold, her breath catching as the pieces snapped into place, the gas station flashing in her mind. Dunn's grip, Holt's absence. They'd planted it, framed her, turned her escape into a noose. "That's not mine," she said, her voice firm, rising above the clamor as they cuffed her again, the metal colder this time, tighter. "You're being recorded, check the footage." The burly cop laughed, hauling her up, his grip bruising her arm as he shoved her toward a squad car. "Tell it to the judge, sweetheart. You're going downtown." The crowd murmured, some shouting, others filming, the scene a circus of flashing lights and accusations. Holt stepped forward, his face blank but his eyes gleaming, leaning close as they passed. "Should have stayed quiet," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. Dunn chuckled, behind him cracking his knuckles, the sound a promise of worse to come. Lena's heart pounded, but her mind clicked into gear, her fingers brushing the phone in her pocket as they shoved her into the car. She hit record, the app silent but live, capturing every word, every move, her voice steady as she muttered, "Into it. July 23rd, 5:42 p.m., Chattahoochee Bridge. Officers Holt and Dunn, setup confirmed." The door slammed, the lock clicked, and the car lurched forward, the city lights streaking past as they hauled her away. She'd seen the tracker, felt the trap, but this was bigger, uglier, a blow she hadn't braced for. They thought they'd buried her, thought the drugs would stick, but she'd caught them on tape, a lifeline she'd cling to. The precinct loomed ahead, a gray fortress against the skyline, and she braced herself, knowing this was just the start. Holt and Dunn had swung hard, but she wasn't down yet, not by a mile. The squad car's interior reeked of mildew and cheap pine air freshener, a stale cocoon that pressed in on Lena Brooks as the tires hummed over Atlanta's potholed streets. Her wrists burned under the cuffs, the metal digging deeper than at the airport, a fresh layer of pain stacking onto the bruises from Holt and Dunn's first assault. The burly cop in the driver's seat, his name tag reading Officer Grayson, kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched tight, while his partner, in the passenger seat, barked updates into the radio, static crackling with words like "suspect secured" and "narcotics bust." Lena sat rigid in the back, her navy blazer crumpled, her dark eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, catching Grayson's occasional glance, a flicker of unease he couldn't hide. Her phone, still recording in her pocket, hummed silently against her thigh, a lifeline she'd activated on the bridge, capturing every second of this nightmare. The precinct loomed ahead, a squat brick building bathed in the orange glow of sodium lights, and as the car rolled to a stop, the doors flew open, a swarm of uniforms spilling out to meet them. Grayson hauled her from the back seat, his grip, a vice on her arm, dragging her through a gauntlet of jeering cops and flashing cameras. A crowd had already gathered, locals and passers-by drawn by the sirens, their phones up, filming the spectacle as Grayson paraded her past, the brick of cocaine dangling from his hand like a hunter's prize. Black trash always slips up, Travis. Holt's voice cut through the din, loud and deliberate. His blonde buzz cut glinting as he stepped into view, his smirk a blade aimed straight at her. Kyle Dunn flanked him, his broad frame hulking beside the precinct steps, his scarred knuckles flexing as he laughed, a guttural sound that echoed off the walls. The crowd shifted, some gasping, others muttering, a few shouting slurs that blended into the chaos, a chorus of hate Lena had heard too many times before. Her boots scuffed the concrete as Grayson shoved her forward, the cuffs rattling, her heart pounding, but her face a mask of stone. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a flinch, wouldn't let them see the rage boiling beneath her calm. They thought they'd won, thought the drugs would stick, thought they could bury her in this public humiliation. But she'd caught their voices on tape, Holt's slur a noose they didn't know they'd tied around their own necks. The precinct. Doors swallowed her, the cool air inside a sharp contrast to the muggy night. And they marched her to a holding cell, a gray box with a single bench and a flickering bulb. Grayson uncuffed her, tossing her into the cell with a grunt, the door slamming shut behind her, the lock clicking with a finality that echoed in her ears. She rubbed her wrists, the red welts pulsing, and sank onto the bench, her mind racing, piecing together the setup, the gas station, the tracker, the brick. Holt and Dunn had played dirty, escalated from insults to a felony frame-up, their racism a weapon they wielded with brutal precision. She'd outsmarted them once, walked free from the airport, but this was a different beast, a blow meant to crush her for good. Hours crawled by, the cell's silence broken only by the distant clang of doors and the murmur of voices beyond the bars, until a new sound cut through, sharp heels clicking against the tile. Jamal Pierce pushed through the precinct doors, a 35-year-old lawyer with a lean frame and a fire in his brown eyes, his suit as sharp as his tongue. He'd been Lena's friend since college, her legal shield through a dozen battles, and now he stormed in, briefcase in hand, his voice booming as he demanded to see her. "Where's Dr. Brooks? You've got no grounds to hold her. I want her out now." The desk sergeant, a wiry man with a gray mustache, flinched under Jamal's glare, fumbling with paperwork as he muttered about procedure, but Jamal didn't back down, slamming a stack of documents on the counter, his finger jabbing at the words. "No priors, no evidence chain, no warrant. This is a sham and I've got her phone recording to prove it. Release her or I'll have this place crawling with feds by morning." The sergeant caved, buzzing the cell block, and minutes later, a guard escorted Lena out, her blazer wrinkled but her head high, her eyes locking with Jamal's as he pulled her into a quick, fierce hug. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, and she nodded, her throat tight, the relief washing over her like a wave. They'd checked her record, found it spotless, and the faulty evidence excuse had sprung her, the brick's origin too shaky to hold up. She dodged another bullet, outmaneuvered their trap again, and as they stepped outside, the night air cool against her skin, she let herself breathe, let herself believe it might be over. Holt and Dunn stood across the lot, leaning against a cruiser, their faces shadowed but their eyes burning. Holt's glare a promise of vengeance, Dunn's fists clenched like he wanted to charge. "You're lucky this time," Holt called, his voice carrying over the hum of traffic, a threat wrapped in a sneer. Lena didn't respond, just turned to Jamal, her voice steady. "They're not done. We need that tape out there." He nodded, already pulling his phone, ready to upload the recording, to turn their words into a weapon. She hugged him again, the tension easing, the precinct fading behind them as they walked to his car, her sedan still impounded, her mind on the fight ahead. She'd won this round, walked free again, and the taste of it was sweet, a fleeting high she clung to as they drove off, the city lights streaking past. But the victory unraveled faster than she could savor it. She crashed at Jamal's place, too wired to sleep, her phone buzzing with texts from colleagues, friends, all asking about the arrest, the video already leaking online. She scrolled through, her chest tight, when a new alert popped up, a photo from an unknown number. Her silver sedan, parked in her midtown condo's driveway, engulfed in flames, the fire licking the night sky. The blaze so fierce it melted the tires to the pavement. Her breath caught, her hands shaking as she zoomed in, spotting a figure in the shadows. Holt's lanky silhouette unmistakable, a gas can dangling from his hand. The text beneath read, "Next time, it's you." Her heart slammed against her ribs, the false hope shattering like glass. The wind she'd clutched slipping through her fingers. They'd let her go, sure, but this was their counterpunch, a brutal escalation that turned her sanctuary to ash. She showed Jamal, his face hardening as he grabbed his laptop, pulling up security feeds, legal forms, anything to fight back. "They're unhinged," he said, his voice tight, and she nodded, her jaw set, her eyes burning with a fire of her own. Holt and Dunn had swung again, harder, meaner, their racism a torch they'd lit to burn her down. She'd walked free from the cell, thought she'd beaten them, but they'd torched her car, her peace, her safety, a message she couldn't ignore. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and as the flames flickered on her screen, she knew the next move was hers, a counterstrike they wouldn't see coming. The glow of Jamal Pierce's laptop screen cast sharp shadows across his cramped living room. The hum of the city outside a distant murmur as Lena Brooks sat on his worn leather couch, her navy blazer discarded, her arms crossed tight against her chest. The photo of her torched sedan still burned in her mind, the flames a vivid scar against the night sky, Holt's silhouette a ghost she couldn't shake. It was past midnight, the clock ticking toward 1 a.m., but sleep was a stranger, her pulse racing with every replay of the day's chaos. Jamal tapped away, uploading her phone recording from the bridge, Holt's voice snarling, "Black trash always slips up." Now a digital dagger aimed at their throats. "This goes live, they're toast," he said, his brown eyes glinting with a mix of fury and hope, his fingers flying over the keys. Lena nodded, her jaw tight, her voice low. "Make it loud." He hit send, and within minutes, the video exploded online, a wildfire spreading across social media, 5 million views racking up before the sun breached the horizon. By morning, the internet was a war zone, hashtags like "Yo, justice for Lena" and "The racist cops" trending, the clip looping on every platform, Holt's slur a rallying cry for outrage. Protesters swarmed the precinct by noon, a sea of bodies clogging the streets of downtown Atlanta, their chants echoing off the brick walls. "No! More lies! Free Lena Brooks!" Signs bobbed above the crowd, some scrawled with her name, others with fists raised in ink, the air thick with sweat and defiance. News vans rolled in, cameras panning the chaos, reporters shouting over the din, their mics thrust toward anyone who'd talk. Lena watched it unfold from Jamal's TV, the screen splitting between the protest and her arrest video, the bridge scene replaying in grainy detail. The cocaine brick waved like a prop in a bad movie. Her chest swelled, a flicker of vindication warming the cold knot of fear Holt's fire had left behind. She'd been cuffed, framed, her car reduced to ash, but now the world was listening, the tide turning in her favor. Jamal grinned, slapping the couch arm. "They can't hide from this." She allowed herself a small smile, the first in hours, and stepped up, agreeing to a press conference that afternoon, a chance to strike back. At 3 p.m., she stood on the steps of City Hall, the July sun blazing down at 95 degrees Fahrenheit, her borrowed white blouse crisp despite the heat, her dark eyes fierce as she faced a wall of mics and lenses. "I'm Dr. Lena Brooks," she began, her voice steady, cutting through the hum of the crowd. "Yesterday, officers Travis Holt and Kyle Dunn targeted me at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport because of my skin. They insulted me, cuffed me, planted drugs, and burned my car. This isn't just about me, it's about every black person they've tried to silence. I won't stop until they're held accountable." The crowd roared, applause crashing like thunder, phones flashing as her words hit home. She laid it bare, the racism raw and unfiltered, the setup a spotlight on their hate. By evening, the mayor's office buckled, a press release hitting the wires. Holt and Dunn suspended pending a full review, their badges yanked, their power stripped. Lena watched the announcement from Jamal's couch, a glass of water trembling in her hand, the weight of it sinking in. She'd done it, turned their trap into a cage for them. The public's fury, a hammer she'd wielded. "We got 'em," Jamal said, his voice thick with pride. And she nodded, letting herself believe it, letting the wind settle into her bones. She'd walked free from the precinct, survived the fire, and now the world had her back, justice inching closer with every chant. Outside, the high lasted until her phone buzzed, a call from her boss at the cybersecurity firm, a curt voice she'd always respected. "Lena, we've seen the news. Too much drama. We're letting you go." The line went dead, her breath catching, the room spinning as the words sank in. Fired. After 10 years, countless contracts, a keynote that had shaken the industry, they'd cut her loose, the backlash a stain they wouldn't touch. She dropped the phone, her hands shaking, the victory souring into ash. Jamal cursed, pacing, but she just stared at the screen, the mayor's statement looping, a hollow triumph now. She'd beaten the cops, sure, but the system had swung back, her career torched as surely as her car. She thought it was over, thought the suspension was the endgame, until a knock rattled the door, sharp and insistent. Jamal opened it, revealing a courier, a kid in a faded cap, thrusting an envelope into his hands before bolting. Inside, a single sheet, no signature, just a photo of the press conference taped to it, her face circled in red ink, and a dozen fake texts printed below, claiming she was a cartel hacker, a mole who'd sold secrets for cash. Her stomach dropped, the lies a venomous echo of Holt's voice, his handiwork screaming through every line. "They're hitting back," she whispered, her voice cracking, and Jamal's face darkened, his fists clenching as he read. The texts were already online, seeded. Hours ago, her allies texting her now, confused, angry, some cutting ties, the narrative flipping overnight. Holt, enraged by the suspension, had struck from the shadows, turning her win into a quagmire, her reputation a battlefield he'd rigged to explode. She'd thought the crowd was her shield, the suspension her sword, but he'd lit a new fire, one she couldn't douse with a speech. The room closed in, the chants outside fading to a dull roar, her mind racing as she grabbed the laptop, searching for the source, knowing Holt and Dunn wouldn't stop, their hate a beast that fed on her. Every step forward. "Hey, how's Lena holding up under this storm?" Comment number 1 if you think she's got the grit to crush Holt's lies, or number 2 if you're worried he's got her cornered this time. What would you do with a snake like that pulling strings? If her fight's got your blood pumping, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and stick around to see her next move. Can she outsmart a smear campaign this vicious? Or is Holt's revenge just warming up? The clock on Jamal Pierce's wall ticked past 2 a.m., its hands a slow crawl through the suffocating silence of his Atlanta apartment, the city outside a muted hum beneath the weight of Lena Brooks's unraveling world. She sat hunched on the couch, her borrowed white blouse wrinkled, her dark eyes hollow as she scrolled through her phone, each buzz a fresh cut. Friends who'd cheered her press conference now texted doubts. Colleagues unfollowed her online. Neighbors she'd waved to for years left voicemails demanding she move out, their voices thick with fear and scorn. The fake texts Holt had planted, branding her a cartel hacker, had spread like poison, 5,000 retweets in hours, her name a trending smear across every platform. Her career was ash, her car a charred husk, and now her community turned its back, the backlash a tidal wave she couldn't outrun. Jamal paced behind her, his lean frame taut, his brown eyes flashing as he slammed a fist into his palm. "This is bullshit, Lena. We'll sue 'em all, the firm, the cops, everyone." She didn't answer, just stared at the screen, the photo of her circled in red ink burning in her mind, Holt's invisible hand tightening around her throat. She'd beaten them at the precinct, turned the crowd into her army, but this was a gut punch she hadn't braced for, a betrayal that hit deeper than cuffs or flames. A sharp rap at the door jolted her, and Jamal cracked it open, peering out, before stepping back, his face hardening. Taped to the wood was a printout of the fake texts, the words "cartel bitch" scrawled across it in black marker, a hunting knife pinning it in place, the blade sunk an inch into the frame. Lena's breath caught, her hands trembling as she stood. The message a neon sign of Holt's rage, his suspension fueling a vendetta that wouldn't quit. "He's unhinged," Jamal said, yanking the knife free, the paper fluttering to the floor. But Lena's mind was already moving, her cybersecurity instincts kicking in. "We trace it," she said, her voice low, steady despite the storm in her chest. She grabbed her laptop, the one she'd kept at Jamal's, and dove into the digital muck, her fingers flying as she hunted the burner phone that had sent the texts. Hours bled into dawn, the sky lightening to a bruised gray, and she found it, a cheap prepaid number linked to a gas station purchase 3 miles from the precinct. She cross-checked it with a contact, a jittery tech guy named Ray she'd met at a conference, a weasel who'd sell his soul for $50. She called him, her voice ablaze through the static. "Ray, it's Lena Brooks. Who paid you to leak those texts?" He stammered, his breath hitching, but she pressed, relentless. "Don't lie. I've got the receipt. Talk." He cracked, his voice a whine. "It was Holt, okay? Gave me $200 cash yesterday. Said to spread it fast. I didn't know it'd blow up like this." She hung up, her jaw tight, the confession a spark in the dark. But before she could tell Jamal, a crash shattered the quiet, glass exploding inward as a brick sailed through the window, landing with a thud on the carpet. Lena ducked, her heart slamming against her ribs, and Jamal lunged for the light switch, plunging the room into shadow. She crawled to the wall, peering out through the jagged hole, the street below alive with movement. 3 masked figures in, hoodies sprinting away, their laughter a jagged echo in the humid air. Jamal grabbed the brick, a note tied to it with twine, the words, "Leave or burn," scrawled in the same black marker. But the real message was painted across his building, red spray paint dripping down the brick facade, "Nigger lover" in letters 3 feet tall. Lena's stomach churned, the slur a slap that hit harder than the brick, the racism a beast that wouldn't sleep. She stood, her legs shaky, and snapped a photo, her voice trembling but firm. "They're escalating." Jamal nodded, his fists clenched, but his eyes held a fire that matched hers. "We've got Ray. That's something." She shook her head, the weight of it crushing her. "Not enough. They've turned everyone against me." The condo was trashed by the time they searched it. Furniture flipped, books shredded, more slurs carved into the walls. Coon and traitor etched deep with a blade. Her allies were gone, her job lost, her car ash, and now her safe. Haven was a war zone. Holt and Dunn's hate a flood she couldn't stem. She sank to the floor, glass crunching under her knees, her mind spinning until a memory clicked. The airport footage from Part 3, Holt planting the tracker, a thread she hadn't pulled. "Jamal," she said, her voice rising. "The security cams. I hacked them after the bag slash. Holt's on tape." He froze, then grinned, a wild edge to it. "That's our shot." She pulled up her cloud drive, her fingers trembling as she found the file, the grainy video loading slow but clear, Holt's lanky frame crouching by her bag, the tracker slipping into the lining, Dunn's laugh a faint rumble in the background. Her breath hitched, a lifeline in the chaos, hard proof of their setup, a weapon she could wield. "We've got him," she said, her voice steadying, the fire reigniting in her chest. She'd been isolated, beaten down, her world torched by their lies, but this was her counterpunch, a move they hadn't seen coming. The condo stank of paint and fear, the dawn breaking over a city that had turned on her. But she stood, the laptop clutched tight, her eyes burning with a resolve that wouldn't break. Holt and Dunn had swung hard, thought they'd buried her in shame, but she'd found a crack in their armor, a shard of truth to stab back with. They'd trashed her. Life turned her into a pariah, but she wasn't done. Not yet. Not while she had this. The morning sun clawed through the shattered window of Jamal Pierce's Atlanta apartment, its rays glinting off the glass strewn across the carpet, a jagged battlefield left by Holt and Dunn's masked thugs. Lena Brooks stood amidst the wreckage, her borrowed white blouse stained with dust, her dark eyes locked on the laptop screen, the airport footage looping in grainy silence. Travis Holt's lanky frame crouched by her slashed bag, slipping the tracker in with a smirk. Kyle Dunn's chuckle a faint hum in the background, hard proof of their setup glowing like a beacon in her hands. Her chest tightened, a mix of fury and hope surging through her, the first real weapon she'd grasped since this nightmare began. Jamal paced beside her, his lean frame coiled tight, his brown eyes darting between the screen and the spray-painted slurs dripping down his walls. "Nigger lover," a red scar against the brick. "This is it, Lena," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We take this to court, bury them." She nodded, her jaw set, her fingers trembling as she saved the file, emailing it to Jamal's secure Dropbox, a lifeline she wouldn't let slip. They'd trashed her life, turned her into a pariah, but this tape was her swingback, a blade to cut through their lies. She grabbed her phone, dialing Jamal's law firm, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We're filing federal, abuse of power, racial profiling, the works. Get me to a judge." By noon, they were downtown, the firm's office a sleek glass tower cutting into the humid July sky, 97 degrees Fahrenheit baking the streets below. Jamal's partner, a wiry woman named Carla with a steel-trap mind, took the footage, her lips pursing as she watched, her pen scribbling notes fast. "This is gold," she said. "We'll fast-track it. I know a judge who'll bite." Hours later, they stood in a courthouse off Peachtree Street, the air inside cool and sharp, a black judge named Evelyn Carter presiding, her silver hair pulled tight, her brown eyes piercing as she reviewed the file. Lena sat beside Jamal, her hands clasped, her borrowed blouse swapped for a gray suit Carla had lent her, her bruises hidden, but her resolve bare. Holt and Dunn slouched across the room, summoned on short notice, their suspension badges gone but their smirks intact. Holt's blonde buzz cut glinting under the lights, Dunn's scarred knuckles tapping the table. Judge Carter's gavel cracked, silencing the hum, and she leaned forward, her voice a low thunder. "Dr. Brooks, present your evidence." Lena stood, her legs steady, and handed over a USB drive, her words sharp as she spoke. "This is Officer Holt planting a tracker in my bag at Hartsfield-Jackson, July 23rd. It's the root of a setup. That's cost me my car, my job, my home. They framed me, attacked me, all because I'm black and dared to fight back." The courtroom buzzed, reporters in the back scribbling, cameras rolling as the footage played on a screen. Holt's move undeniable, Dunn's laugh a damning echo. Carter's eyes narrowed, her gaze flicking to the cops, their smirks fading fast. Holt's fingers twitching, Dunn's bulk shifting uncomfortably. "Officers," she said, her tone ice. "Explain this." Holt shrugged, his voice slick but shaky. "Routine security, Your Honor. She's blowing it out of proportion." Dunn nodded, his grunt a weak backup. But Carter wasn't buying it, her head tilting as she tapped the desk. "Routine doesn't include trackers without a warrant. This stinks of malice." She ruled fast, her gavel slamming again, the sound a gunshot in the quiet. "Case moves forward, expedited. Defendants remain suspended, no contact with plaintiff." Lena exhaled, a rush of triumph flooding her, Jamal's hand squeezing her shoulder as they left the courtroom, the press swarming, headlines already screaming, "Racist cops exposed," across every feed. By nightfall, the story hit national news, 10 million views on the footage, protests swelling outside the precinct, the mayor's office scrambling to save face. She and Jamal grabbed takeout, retreating to a cheap motel on EU, the city's edge, her condo a crime scene, his place a wreck. They sat on stiff beds, eating fried chicken from styrofoam, the TV blaring their win, and she let herself laugh, a rare sound that felt like sunlight after weeks of storm. "We turned it around," she said, her voice soft, and Jamal grinned, raising a drumstick like a toast. Damn right. She'd outsmarted them again, flipped their trap into a noose, the judges ruling a shield she'd wielded with precision. Holt and Dunn were sweating, their power crumbling, and for a moment she believed she'd won. The tide finally hers. The motel's neon sign buzzed outside, a faint green flicker through the blinds, and she leaned back, her eyes drifting shut, the day's weight lifting. Then the power cut, a sudden blackout plunging the room into dark, the TV dying mid-sentence, the AC's hum choking off. Lena bolted upright, her heart slamming, Jamal dropping his food as he grabbed his phone. The screen's glow a lone light. "Storm?" he asked, but the sky was clear, the night still. A faint hiss slithered through the vents, a chemical tang stinging her nose, and her gut screamed danger, Holt's shadow looming in her mind. She lunged for the door, Jamal behind her, But the knob wouldn't turn, jammed tight, the hiss growing, louder, gas seeping in fast. "He's here," she rasped, her voice tight. And Jamal kicked the door, wood splintering but holding. Smoke curled under the frame, thick and acrid, and a boom shook the walls, an explosion ripping through the motel's east wing, flames licking the night sky 50 feet away. Lena's lungs burned, her eyes watering as she grabbed a chair, smashing. The window glass raining down as she climbed out, Jamal tumbling after her, the fire roaring closer. They hit the gravel lot, coughing, her gray suit torn, his shirt singed, the motel a blazing inferno behind them, screams echoing from other rooms. She spun, scanning the dark, and caught Holt's lanky frame across the street, his face lit by the firelight, a gas can swinging from his hand, his eyes wild with rage. He'd hired a thug, rigged the gas line, turned her victory into a death trap, his suspension a spark that had lit this madness. Sirens wailed in the distance, red lights flashing as fire trucks roared in. But Holt vanished into the shadows, his counterpunch a blaze that swallowed her brief triumph. She stood, her legs shaking, Jamal's arm around her, the heat searing. Her back as the motel crumbled, her wind torched again. Holt's hate a beast that wouldn't die. Flames devoured the motel's east wing, a roaring beast that painted the Atlanta night in shades of orange and black. The heat a blistering 98 degrees Fahrenheit, even at 2 a.m. Lena Brooks stumbled across the gravel lot, her gray, suit torn at the knees, her dark skin slick with sweat and streaked with soot, her lungs screaming as she coughed up the acrid gas Holt had pumped through the vents. Jamal Pierce staggered beside her, his shirt singed, his lean frame hunched, as he clutched her arm, pulling her away from the inferno. The explosion had ripped through the building seconds after they'd smashed the window, a fireball that swallowed half the structure, glass and wood raining down like shrapnel. Her ears rang, a high-pitched whine drowning out the sirens wailing. Closer, her left arm throbbing where a shard had grazed her, blood seeping through the fabric. She'd seen Holt's lanky silhouette across the street, the gas can swinging. His wild eyes a promise of death, his suspension twisting him into a monster who'd rather burn her alive than let her win. The motel crumbled behind them, a skeleton of charred beams and melting siding, screams piercing the night as other guests fled, some trapped, their cries a haunting echo. Firefighters swarmed in, hoses blasting, their shouts lost in the chaos, and Lena sank to her knees, her vision blurring, the gravel biting into her palms. Jamal dropped beside her, his breath ragged, his brown eyes wide with shock. "We made it," he rasped, but she shook her head, her voice a croak. "Barely." Her arm hung limp, the pain sharpening, and she felt the snap, a fracture from the fall, her body a map of wounds from Holt's latest swing. Paramedics rushed over, their gloved hands lifting her onto a stretcher, oxygen flooding her lungs as they sped her to Grady Memorial Hospital, the city lights streaking past in a haze. She faded in and out, the ambulances beeping a lifeline, Jamal's voice a distant anchor as he rode with her, his hand gripping hers. Hours later, she woke in a sterile white room, the clock reading 6 a.m., her arm in a cast, burns bandaged across her shoulder, an IV dripping into her vein. The TV flickered, news replaying the motel blaze, arson suspected scrolling across the ticker, her name a whisper in the anchor's report. Jamal sat beside her, his face haggard, his suit jacket gone, replaced by a hospital blanket. "They're saying you did it," he said, his voice tight, and she sat up, wincing, her head pounding as the words sank in. "What?" He handed her his phone, a police statement glowing on the screen, claiming the fire started in her room. Arson by occupant. Holt's frame-up twisting the knife deeper. Her chest tightened, rage flaring through the pain, his racism a noose that wouldn't loosen. She'd escaped his trap, crawled through flames, but he'd turned her survival into another lie, the system swallowing his bait whole. She gripped the bed rail, her knuckles whitening, when a shadow moved in the doorway, a nurse in blue scrubs slipping in, her blonde hair pulled tight, her eyes darting nervously. "Dr. Brooks?" she whispered, her voice low, and Lena nodded, wary, her instincts screaming. The nurse glanced back, then stepped closer, a syringe glinting in her hand, her lips parting. "I'm sorry. He paid me." Before Lena could react, Kyle Dunn loomed behind her, his bulk filling the frame, his scarred knuckles flexing as he hissed, "End this now!" The nurse lunged, the needle aimed at Lena's IV, a lethal dose shimmering in the tube. But Lena's reflexes kicked in, her good hand ripping the line free as she rolled off the bed, crashing to the floor. Jamal leapt up, shouting, and she faked a seizure, her body thrashing, her cast slamming the tile to sell it. The nurse hesitated, the syringe trembling, and Lena lashed out, her good fist smashing the woman's wrist, the needle skittering across the room. Dunn roared, charging in, his fist swinging, but Jamal tackled him, their bodies slamming into the wall, a tangle of grunts and fury. Lena scrambled up, her fractured arm screaming, and grabbed the syringe, jabbing it into Dunn's thigh as he pinned Jamal, the plunger sinking fast. He bellowed, staggering back, his eyes rolling as the drug hit, his bulk crumpling to the floor, a heap of twitching muscle. The nurse shrieked, bolting for the door, but Lena lunged, her good arm hooking the woman's neck, slamming her into the bed frame, knocking her cold. Jamal panted, blood trickling from his lip, and Lena sank against the wall, her chest heaving, the room spinning as alarms blared, staff rushing in. She dodged death again, turned Dunn's assassination into a flop, her mind racing as she grabbed a burner phone from the nurse's pocket, dialing Jamal's number, her voice a rasp. "We're not safe here." He nodded, helping her up, her cast heavy, her burns stinging, the hospital a trap she'd barely escaped. Holt and Dunn had swung harder, from fire to poison, their hate a relentless storm. But she'd flipped it, fought, back with raw grit. Security stormed in, cuffing the nurse, dragging Dunn's limp form away, and Lena leaned on Jamal, her eyes burning with a fire that wouldn't die. They'd thought her broken, thought the blaze and the needle would finish her, but she'd clawed out, a survivor they couldn't bury. "Hey, how's Lena's fight hitting you?" Comment number 1 if you're cheering her out, smarting Dunn's dirty move. Or number 2 if you think Holt's next play might finally break her. Would you have the guts to fake a seizure under that pressure? If her defiance has you hooked, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and stay with us to see how she keeps swinging. What's Holt cooking up now that his partner's down, and can Lena outrun his wrath one more time? The hospital corridor buzzed with chaos, alarms shrieking as nurses and security swarmed the room where Lena Brooks had just floored Kyle Dunn and his hired nurse, her fractured arm throbbing in its cast, her burns a raw sting beneath the bandages. Jamal Pierce stood beside her, his lips swollen, his brown eyes darting as he helped her limp past the gurney where Dunn lay twitching, the syringe's contents still coursing through him. Her gray suit hung in tatters, her dark skin slick with sweat, but her mind was a steel trap, already plotting the next move. Holt was out there unhinged, his gas can silhouette a ghost in her memory, and this hospital was a kill box she wouldn't survive twice. She clutched the nurse's burner phone, her voice a rasp as she leaned on Jamal. "We lure him. End this." He nodded, his jaw tight, and they slipped out a side exit, the July night thick with humidity, 90 degrees Fahrenheit pressing down on Atlanta's streets. They holed up in a diner 3 miles away, a greasy spoon off Moreland Avenue. Its neon sign flickering, the air inside cool and stale. Lena sank into a booth, her cast heavy on the table, and pulled out her laptop, the one she'd salvaged from Jamal's wrecked condo, its screen cracked but alive. "Fake meeting," she said, her fingers flying as she typed, crafting an email. From a dummy account, her words sharp. "Dr. Brooks to Holt. I'm dropping the suit. Meet me at the old textile mill midnight. Come alone." Jamal watched, his brow furrowing, but he trusted her, his voice low. "He'll bite. He's too pissed to think straight." She sent it, the bait dangling, then rigged the burner to ping a location near the mill, a crumbling relic on the city's edge, its rusted gates a perfect cage. They moved fast, grabbing supplies from a hardware store, duct tape, wire, a cheap mic, her cybersecurity brain turning junk into a trap. By 11 p.m. they were there, the mill's shadows swallowing them. The air thick with dust and rot, the Chattahoochee River a faint gurgle beyond the trees. Lena wired the office, a cavernous room with broken windows, her mic hidden in the rafters, streaming to a cloud server, every sound a weapon she'd wield. Jamal scouted the perimeter, his lean frame blending with the dark, while she waited, her cast a dull ache, her burns itching, her good hand gripping a steel pipe she'd found in the rubble. Midnight struck, the mill's silence breaking as boots crunched gravel outside. Holt's lanky frame stepping through the door, his blonde buzz cut glinting under a flashlight's beam, a pistol in his hand, his eyes wild with rage. Dunn followed. Slower, his bulk unsteady from the hospital dose, a shotgun slung over his shoulder, his scarred knuckles white as he gripped it. They'd come armed, ready to kill. Holt's voice a snarl as he swept the light. "Where's the bitch? I'll bury her myself." Lena stepped from the shadows, her pipe raised, her voice steady. "Right here." Holt spun, his gun snapping up, but she ducked, the shot cracking wide, splintering a beam. Dunn lunged, his shotgun swinging, but Jamal tackled him from behind, the blast tearing into the ceiling, plaster raining down. Lena rolled, her cast slamming Holt's knee, his scream a jagged howl as he stumbled, the pistol skittering across the floor. She grabbed it, her good hand steady, aiming at his chest as he clawed upright, his face a mask of hate. "You're done," she said. But before she could fire, sirens wailed, lights flooding the mill, FBI agents in vests storming through, their shouts a thunderclap. "Drop it! Hands up!" Holt froze, his eyes darting, Dunn groaning under Jamal's knee, the mic catching every curse, every threat, streaming live to the feds she'd tipped via an anonymous call from the diner. Agents cuffed them, Holt's wrists, twisting as he spat. "This ain't over." Dunn's bulk slumping as they dragged him out, the mill a crime scene pulsing with red and blue. Lena lowered the gun, her breath ragged, Jamal rising beside her, his grin fierce as the feds swarmed, their trap a perfect snare. She'd lured them, flipped their murder plot into a bust, the footage a noose they couldn't slip. An agent approached, a tall woman with a clipped voice nodding at her. "Good work, Dr. Brooks. We've got enough to lock them up." Lena exhaled, the wind sinking in, her body trembling as the adrenaline crashed. Holt and Dunn hauled off in cuffs, their snarls fading into the night. She'd outsmarted them again, turned their kill shot into her victory, the mill's dust settling around her like a crown. Jamal clapped her shoulder, his voice thick. "You're a damn genius." She smirked, leaning on him, the pipe clattering to the floor, her cast a badge of survival. They'd swung for her life, thought they'd finish her, but she'd flipped the board, the feds her checkmate. The agent's radio crackled, a call from the precinct chief, Holt's uncle, a gruff voice cutting through. "Release them. Evidence is inadmissible. Family ties." Lena's heart stopped, her smirk vanishing as the agent's face fell, her words sharp. "Orders from above. They're free." The cuffs clicked off, Holt's grin returning. Dunn's laugh a guttural taunt as they stood brushing off the dust, their eyes locking on her with a promise of blood. She'd won, trapped them clean, but the system swung back, their uncles, pull a shield she couldn't pierce. Holt stepped close, his breath hot as he whispered, "You're dead," then turned, vanishing with Dunn into the dark, the feds powerless, the mic still rolling but useless now. Lena's knees buckled, Jamal catching her, his curse a low growl as the agents dispersed, the mill empty again, her victory ash in her mouth. She'd played it perfect, thought she'd ended it, but Holt's next move landed before she could. Blink, a phone buzzing in her pocket, a video from an unknown number. Jamal's face filled the screen, bound and gagged, a warehouse wall behind him. Holt's voice off camera, cold and lethal. "Come alone, or he's meat." The call cut, her breath hitching, the trap she'd set now a noose around her best friend. Holt's racism a blade that wouldn't dull. She'd beaten them here, thought the cuffs were the end, but they'd ripped free, snatched Jamal, turned her win into a nightmare deeper than the flames. The textile mill's rusted gates creaked in the humid Atlanta night, the air a sticky 92 degrees Fahrenheit as Lena Brooks stood alone, her fractured arm throbbing in its cast, her burns a dull ache beneath the bandages, her gray suit, shredded from the fight. The FBI agents had vanished, their sirens fading into the distance. Holt and Dunn freed by their uncle's pull, the trap she'd sprung now a hollow shell. Her phone trembled in her good hand, the video of Jamal Pierce, replaying, his lean frame bound to a chair, duct tape across his mouth, his brown eyes wide with fear, a warehouse wall looming behind him. Holt's voice had cut through, cold and lethal. "Come alone or he's meat." the call a gut punch that turned her victory to dust. She'd beaten them at the mill, cuffed them with her own hands, but they'd slipped the noose, snatched her best friend. Their racism a venom that wouldn't quit. She tracked the signal, her cybersecurity skills a lifeline, pinging the burner to a derelict warehouse 5 miles north, near the Chattahoochee River's muddy banks. She hot-wired a beat-up sedan from the mill's lot, her fingers deft despite the cast, the engine coughing to life as she sped through the city, the skyline a blur of lights against her rage. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking shadow of cracked concrete and broken windows, its roof sagging under years of neglect, the river's stench seeping through the cracks. She parked a block away, her boots silent on the asphalt, her good hand clutching the steel pipe from the mill, her only weapon now. The night was still, crickets chirping, the river a faint gurgle, but her pulse roared, her eyes scanning the dark for Holt's goons. She slipped through a side door, the hinges groaning, the interior a maze of rusted machinery and rotting crates, shadows dancing in the faint moonlight. Voices echoed ahead, low and rough, and she crept closer, her cast scraping a wall, her breath shallow as she peered around a corner. Jamal sat in the center, tied to a metal chair, his suit torn, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. 3 hired thugs circling him, their hoodies stained with sweat, their fists flexing. Holt stood apart, his lanky frame pacing, a revolver in his hand, his blonde buzz cut glinting as he barked orders, his voice a snarl. "She'll come. Then we finish 'em both." Lena's chest tightened, her mind racing, the pipe heavy in her grip. She had to move fast, had to free him before they spotted her. But the odds were brutal, 4 against 1, her body a wreck from the motel blaze. She edged along the wall, her boots silent, and found a stack of gas canisters, rusted but full, a spark of a plan igniting. She worked quick, her good hand twisting a valve, the hiss of propane a faint whisper as she rigged a crate to topple, a distraction to buy her seconds. She kicked it hard, the crash echoing, wood splintering as the thugs spun, shouting, "What the hell?" Holt waved his gun, his eyes darting, and she darted behind Jamal, her pipe slicing through the ropes, his wrists springing free. He ripped the tape off, his voice a rasp. "Go." But she pulled him up, his legs shaky, her cast a dull thud against his back as they ducked low. The thugs charged, their boots pounding, and Holt roared, spotting her, his revolver cracking, a bullet whizzing past her ear, slamming into a beam. She shoved Jamal toward a side exit, her heart slamming, but Holt was faster, his lanky stride closing the gap, his gun swinging up as he fired again, the shot grazing her leg, a hot streak of pain that buckled her knee. She hit the floor, blood seeping through her pants, her pipe rolling away, Holt looming over her, his face twisted with hate. "You're bleed out, princess," he snarled, his boot pressing her cast, the fracture screaming as she bit back a cry. Jamal lunged, tackling a thug, but the others swarmed, fists flying, his grunts a desperate echo. Lena's vision swam, her good hand clawing the dirt, finding a shard of glass, her mind a blur of pain and fury. She had one shot, one move to flip this, and she saw it. The gas canister 10 feet away, its valve still hissing, a matchbook in Holt's pocket glinting as he bent closer. She slashed his ankle with the glass, blood spurting as he howled, staggering back, the matches tumbling free. She rolled, her leg a dead weight, and snatched them, striking one fast, the flame flaring as she tossed it at the canister, her voice a shout. "Jamal, run!" The explosion rocked the warehouse, a deafening boom that sent flames roaring, the blast hurling Holt into a wall, his body crumpling, unconscious, his gun skittering away. The thugs screamed, diving for cover, their hoodies catching fire, the heat a wall that seared Lena's back as she crawled, dragging her leg, Jamal stumbling beside her, his arm around her waist. They burst outside, the night air a cold slap, the warehouse a blazing inferno behind them, smoke billowing into the sky. She collapsed on the riverbank, her breath ragged, blood pooling beneath her, Jamal panting as he tore his sleeve, tying it around her leg, his hand shaking. "You're insane," he said, his voice thick, and she grinned, weak but fierce. Her cast cracked, her burns raw, but alive. She'd freed him, turned Holt's trap into chaos, the explosion a desperate win that left him down but not out. Sirens wailed, distant but closing, and she tensed, her eyes scanning the dark, knowing Dunn was still loose, his bulk a shadow she couldn't see. Before she could stand, a truck roared from the trees, Dunn behind the wheel, his scarred face, twisted with rage, the headlights blinding as he gunned it straight for them. She shoved Jamal aside, rolling, but the bumper clipped her, hurling her into the river, the cold water swallowing her whole, her cast dragging her down, her leg a numb weight as she sank, bubbles streaming from her lips, the current pulling her under. The Chattahoochee River's icy grip yanked Lena Brooks under, its current a relentless claw dragging her down, her fractured arm dead weight in its cracked cast, her burned skin stinging as water flooded her lungs. Her leg bled from Holt's, bullet in Dunn's truck, a crimson trail swirling in the dark, her gray suit shredded, her body a battered shell fighting to surface. Jamal Pierce's shout echoed above, faint through the rush, his lean frame a blur on the bank as he scrambled. After her, the warehouse fire roaring behind him, a beacon of chaos she'd ignited. Her good hand clawed at the murk, nails scraping rocks until her fingers broke free, her head bursting up, gasping air thick with smoke and river stink, the night a humid 90 degrees Fahrenheit pressing down. She kicked, her wounded legs screaming, and grabbed a jutting root, hauling herself to shore, mud caking her as she collapsed beside Jamal, his hands pulling her up, his voice a rasp. "You're alive." She nodded, coughing, her chest heaving, water dripping from her hair, her eyes scanning the dark as sirens wailed closer, red lights flashing through the trees. The warehouse blazed, Holt still inside, maybe dead, maybe not. But Dunn was out here, his truck's growl a fresh wound in her mind, his racism a beast that wouldn't quit. Before she could stand, headlights flared, Dunn's squad screeching from the shadows. 4 cops piling out, guns drawn, their faces twisted with the same hate she'd faced since the airport. "There she is," Dunn bellowed, his bulk storming. Forward, shotgun raised. His scarred knuckles white as he fired, the blast tearing into the bank, mud exploding inches from her head. Jamal dove, tackling her flat, bullets whizzing overhead, the squad fanning out, their shouts a chorus of slurs. "Finish the black bitch!" Lena rolled, her good hand snatching a rock, her mind racing. No pipe, no gun, just grit and a will to live. She'd saved Jamal, blown Holt's trap sky high, but Dunn's crew was a new wave, their badges a shield for murder, the system bending to let them hunt her down. She crawled, her leg dragging, Jamal beside her, and spotted a rusted traffic cam on a pole 50 feet away, its lens a glint in the firelight, a lifeline she could hack. She pulled the burner phone from her pocket, waterlogged but alive, her fingers trembling as she cracked its case, hot wiring it to ping her laptop's cloud, the one she'd left at the diner, its signal weak but enough. She logged in, her breath shallow, bullets pocking the dirt as Dunn's squad closed in, their boots crunching, their guns blazing. "You're done, princess," Dunn roared, his shotgun pumping, a shell ripping through a tree, splinters raining down. She typed fast, her cast a dull thud on the ground, rerouting the cam's feed to a live stream, her voice a whisper into the phone. July 24th, 2 a.m., Chattahoochee Bank. Cops firing on unarmed black woman. Help! The stream went live, her face flashing online, bloodied and defiant. The gunfire a soundtrack millions would hear. The cam catching Dunn's snarl, his squad's hate, a digital noose she'd tied herself. Views spiked, 10,000 in seconds, then 50. The internet waking to her fight, comments flooding, outrage igniting. She ducked, a bullet grazing her shoulder, fresh pain searing, but she grinned, wild and fierce, the world watching now. Her trap sprung anew. Dunn paused, his radio crackling, a voice shouting, "Stand down, it's live!" But he laughed, a guttural sound, and fired again, the blast chewing the bank, dirt blinding her. Jamal yanked her back, his arm bleeding from a stray shot, and they stumbled toward the river, the squad closing, their guns relentless, until a roar split the sky, helicopter blades thumping, National Guard choppers descending, their spotlights blinding, soldiers rappelling down, rifles up. "Drop your weapons!" a voice boomed, amplified, and Dunn froze, his shotgun wavering, his squad faltering as boots hit the ground, guardsmen fanning out, their orders sharp. Lena sank to her knees, her breath ragged. Jamal beside her, the live stream, still rolling, millions watching as the guard cuffed Dunn, his wrists twisting, his snarl a mask of fury as they dragged him to a chopper, his crew following, their guns clattering to the dirt. She'd flipped it, turned their kill shot into a global spectacle, the cam her sword, the guard her shield. But Holt wasn't done. A scream cut through, his lanky frame lunging from the trees, soaked and burned, his face a charred mess, a knife in his hand, his eyes locked on her. "You don't win," he roared, the blade slashing, and she rolled, her leg numb, her good hand catching his wrist, twisting hard, his momentum slamming him past her into a power line dangling from the blaze. Sparks flew, a crackling hiss as volts surged through. Him, his body jerking, the knife dropping, his scream choking off as he fried, smoke curling from his buzz cut, his form slumping to the mud. Dead, Lena stared, her chest heaving, the choppers whirring overhead, Dunn's cuffs clinking as he glared, the guards securing the scene, her livestream a beacon that had saved her. She'd fought off Dunn's squad, burned Holt alive, her wits and will of force they couldn't break, the riverbank a graveyard for their hate. Jamal pulled her up, his arm around her, blood mixing with mud, and she stood, her cast cracked, her burns raw, her leg a ruin, but alive, the night hers, the world, a witness to her stand. The Chattahoochee riverbank lay scarred under the dawn's pale light, the air a muggy 88 degrees Fahrenheit, as Lena Brooks sat on a stretcher, her fractured arm limp in its cracked cast, her burns bandaged, her leg a throbbing mess wrapped in gauze. The National Guard choppers idled nearby, their blades a low thrum, soldiers securing the scene, their rifles glinting as they hauled Kyle Dunn into a van, his bulk slumped, his scarred knuckles bruised from cuffs too tight. Travis Holt's charred, body lay under a tarp, the power line sparks still smoking in the mud, his knife a dull gleam beside him, his racist crusade snuffed out in a flash of volts. Jamal Pierce stood beside her, his lean frame battered, blood crusting his lip, his brown eyes fierce despite the exhaustion, his arm around her shoulder as paramedics checked her vitals, their voices a murmur over the river's gurgle. The warehouse. Fire glowed in the distance, a fading ember of her desperate stand. The live stream she'd hacked still buzzing online. 20 million views now. The world awake to her fight. Medics loaded her into an ambulance, the ride to Emory Hospital a blur of sirens and antiseptic. Her body a wreck but her mind sharp. Replaying Dunn's snarl, Holt's lunge, the guard's descent, a victory carved from blood and grit. She'd outsmarted them, turned their kill squad into a public execution of their hate. Holt dead, Dunn caged, the system forced to bend under the weight of her proof. By noon, she lay in a private room, the TV blaring her triumph, news anchors hailing her a hero. Dr. Lena Brooks exposes racist cops, scrolling in bold protests swelling across Atlanta. The mayor vowing reform, Dunn's mugshot a stain, on every screen. Her gray suit was gone, swapped for a gown, her cast fresh, her burns slathered in cream, an IV dripping painkillers into her vein. Jamal sat by her bed, his suit jacket lost, a hospital blanket draped over him, his grin weak, but real. "You did it," he said, his voice thick, and she nodded, her chest swelling, the win a balm on wounds too deep to count. She'd walked through fire, dodged bullets, flipped every trap, and now the world cheered. Justice a fragile crown she'd claimed. Hours ticked by, the hospital humming with life, cops outside guarding her door, feds taking statements. Dunn's trial fast-tracked, his uncle's pull useless against the live stream's glare. She slept fitfully, dreams of flames and cuffs, waking to a nurse slipping in. A young woman with dark hair and a shy smile, her blue scrubs rustling as she adjusted the IV. "You're a legend out there," the nurse said, her voice soft. And Lena managed a smile, her eyes heavy, the painkillers pulling her under again. The nurse lingered, her hands pausing, then slipped a folded note onto the tray, her whisper barely audible. "You didn't win. Check your blood." She left, the door clicking shut, and Lena frowned, her pulse spiking, her good hand snatching the paper, unfolding it slow, the words a cold stab in her gut. She sat up, wincing, her cast thudding the bed, and called for a doctor, her voice hoarse but firm. "Run tests now. Something's wrong. The doctor, a graying man with tired eyes, humored her, ordering a full panel, his brow furrowing as she showed him the note, his nod reluctant but swift. Jamal watched, his face hardening, his blanket slipping as he leaned closer, his voice low. What she mean didn't win? Lena shook her head, her stomach churning, the room tilting as dread clawed up her spine. Hours later, the doctor returned, his clipboard trembling, his eyes avoiding hers as he spoke, his words a hammer. Tox screens back. You've got a slow-acting poison in your system, thallium, trace amounts, but it's there, lethal over weeks. Her breath stopped, her mind flashing to the hospital attack in Part 9. Dunn's nurse, the syringe she'd dodged, the IV she'd ripped free, but not fast enough, a drop slipping in before she'd fought back. How? She rasped, and the doctor swallowed, his voice grim. Likely from your first day post-motel. It's odorless, cumulative. You've got maybe a month unless we chelate it, but damage might stick. Jamal cursed, slamming the bed rail, his eyes wild. But Lena sat still, her vision blurring, not from tears, but from the poison's first whisper, a haze at the edges she hadn't noticed. She'd beaten them on the riverbank, killed Holt, caged Dunn, won the world's roar, but this was their final swing, a silent blade planted days ago, Holt's hate outliving him, Dunn's smirk a ghost in her blood. The doctor started treatment, a drip of antidote, but warned her, hair loss, nerve damage, may be permanent. We caught it late. She nodded, her jaw tight, her good hand clenching the sheet, the hero's crown a lie now, justice a hollow shell. Days bled into weeks, Dunn sentenced to life, no parole, his trial a circus of her footage, the live stream a noose he couldn't slip, his uncle fired, the precinct gutted by reform, protests birthing laws in her name. She recovered slow, discharged to a safe house, her hair thinning, her hands shaky, her leg a limp she'd keep, the antidote purging the poison but leaving scars no one saw. She sat by a window, the Atlanta skyline a jagged silhouette, her eyes fierce despite the blur, her voice avowed to Jamal now beside her. His wounds healed but his fire dimmed by her cost. They thought they'd silence me even dead. They're wrong. He nodded, his hand on hers, the city alive with her legacy. But her fight wasn't over. The poison a reminder of roots deeper than badges, a system that had bent, but not broken. She'd won the battle, torched their power, but the war stretched on. A shadow in her veins she'd chased to the end. Lena Brooks's harrowing journey and racist cop insults and handcuffs a black woman at the airport, unaware he's digging his own grave, reveals stark truths about resilience, systemic racism, and the cost of fighting back. First, her story teaches us that courage isn't just surviving the storm, it's turning it against those who wield power unjustly. Lena faced relentless racial injustice, from cuffs to arson to poison, yet flipped every trap with grit and cunning, proving one, person can spark change. Second, it exposes how deeply racism embeds itself, not just in individuals like Holt and Dunn, but in systems that shield them. Their uncles pull a chilling reminder of privilege's reach. Her live-streamed stand shows technology can amplify truth, but the poison in her blood warns that victory comes with unseen scars. Third, it's a lesson in vigilance. Holt's final blow outlasting his death, a testament to hate's persistence. Lena's refusal to bow, even as her body faltered, underscores that justice demands sacrifice, a price she paid to dismantle their power. Finally, it's a call to see beyond headlines. Her win, a fragile shield against a war far from over. We learn that standing up isn't a single battle. It's a lifetime of pushing back, a torch passed to us all. So what's your take? How far would you go to fight this kind of evil? Drop a comment with your thoughts. Hit like if Lena's fire inspires you. Subscribe for more tales of defiance and share to spread her truth. Thanks for riding this wild journey with us. Here's to strength in the face of darkness. May you never stop challenging the shadows.